Hi, everyone. So I'm Anya Kadadeglia. I'm the editor of The Wire Report. We're a Hill Times publishing online publication. We focus on telecom and media from political, business, regulatory point of view. And today we're going to be talking about online regulation. There's a lot of legislation that's been promised on this, including this week. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of kind of what's been promised and what's happening, and then I'm going to throw it to our panelists. And I also do want to remind everybody watching, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat function. We will have a section for audience questions. So just go ahead and do that at any point during the discussion. So I'll start off with, I'm sure you saw there was a bill introduced this week by the Heritage Minister, Steven Guilbeault, C10. And what that bill does is it updates the Broadcasting Act. So it sets up the CRTC to be able to regulate streaming services and online platforms. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more on that from one of our panelists, Peter Menzies, a former CRTC commissioner. And that is basically focused on regulating for the purposes of CanCon and on streaming services like Netflix specifically. But there's some other pieces of online regulation that we're going to be talking about today as well. And the first of those is taxes. So the government has said that they will be extending the sales tax to foreign online streaming services. That's supposed to be in the next budget. There was also a corporate tax that was promised, and that's for the biggest web giants. When that's coming is we don't know. That's still to be determined. And then, of course, there's the question of compensation for Google and Facebook to pay news publishers for linking to their content. That's something we'll also be touching on. And it's something that the government has promised is coming very soon. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like. I did ask Minister Guilbeault about that this week, and he said they're still in the process of figuring out what it's going to look like. So is it going to be a negotiation-based model between the platforms and publishers? Is it going to be a copyright board or a competition bureau taking charge of it? That's all in the process of being worked out. And then, of course, the last piece that we're going to be talking a lot about today is the promised rules on hate speech and takedowns. So Guilbeault, again, was tasked with creating, quote, new rules for social media platforms, starting with the requirement that all platforms remove illegal content, including hate speech, within 24 hours. And then also this summer, the Minister of Justice has also been consulting on this question, has issued a consultation paper that we'll be hearing more about from Christine later on. So no legislation has been introduced on that quite yet. So those are kind of the main pieces of of what we can expect to see in terms of online regulation in the coming months and years. And I wanted to start off with asking Peter Menzies for his thoughts. Peter is a former Calgary Herald publisher. He's a former CRTC commissioner, and he is a fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute.
Thanks. I guess the broad overview is that you just outlined a set of solutions looking for a problem. The legislation introduced this week is designed to get money from web giants largely, and in order to do that, it is stifling consumer choice. It is very likely to stifle innovation and investment, and it will interfere with, for instance, looking for Canadian content on Netflix. Right now, it's easy enough to find it just by going into the search engine on Netflix and typing Canadian. So why they're going through all this is a mystery, other than that it serves some long-standing vested interests. It's really a money grab. Consumers will suffer. They will pay more for their online subscriptions. And basically, the internet world is going to be captured in the old broadcasting world. I don't know that really is where we want to go as a nation. We should be focusing on the internet and its freedom and its accessibility and its affordability. And here we are worrying about whether Schitt's Creek comes up first on Netflix when you sign in. It's quite stunning. That's my introduction.
And Next up is Rachel Curran. She is a lawyer, former director of policy to Stephen Harper, and she's currently the public policy manager for Facebook Canada. And Rachel, I'm hoping that you can give us kind of the perspective of social media platforms to some of these upcoming regulations.
Yeah, I guess we're not quite as negative as Peter is on some of these things. I mean, there certainly are concerns, especially for conservatives, but let me just go through the pieces that you identified, Anya. On the tax front, look, I think there's no dispute that online platforms should pay the same sales tax that every other business operating in a province pays. Certainly from Facebook's side, we're very, very willing to do that. We've been asking the government to introduce that legislation for a while now. So the sense that, these big companies are just not willing to pay tax is absolutely untrue. I expect the government's going to introduce legislation on that front in the next few months. But again, that's something we've been asking for quite a while. Digital services tax, that's a little bit different. We can get into that discussion. The other piece you talked about is support for Canadian news publishers, the beleaguered Canadian news industry. Again, from Facebook's side, we don't agree with how the news publishers have framed the problem. We don't think the problem is that the internet was invented and, ad revenue migrated over to platforms like Craigslist and then to Google and Facebook. But we do absolutely appreciate the value of kind of independent, robust journalism, news journalism, and we want to work with news publishers to find sustainable business models for that kind of work. So we could talk a little bit about sort of what we see as the possible solutions to that don't simply involve sort of transferring a portion of online platforms' revenue to, mainstream news publishers who haven't been successful in adapting to new realities. And then the last piece you talked about and I think the one that's probably most controversial and of most interest to conservatives is hate speech online. And, where you draw that line, what qualifies as hate speech, what people should and shouldn't be allowed to say on social media platforms. I mean, that is a really fraught area. On Facebook's side, we spend a ton of time working on developing what we call community standards. That's a multi-page document that's public. It sort of sets the guidelines and the guardrails for what we allow on the platform. And the motivations for that, and there really is essentially no kind of government regulation existing in this area. Canada is very much oriented towards kind of a protection of free speech model, at least currently. So what Facebook has done, a platform like Facebook has done, this is true on other platforms too, is develop its own sort of rules for what is and isn't allowed. And we spend a lot of time doing that in a way that makes the platform like a pleasant place to be for users, a fun and engaging place, ideally, without restricting speech, restricting voice unnecessarily. But that line is really tough to draw, and there's a lot of debates, of course, around where we draw it. And, if the government is going to weigh into that debate and those kinds of decisions, I think that's absolutely appropriate for elected representatives to do. But it's tough. It's controversial. So we can talk a little bit more about how they might do it. I think they're going to be very careful. I'd be surprised to see any sort of significant changes coming on this front anytime soon.
And our next panelist, I'm also curious. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, especially. So that's Christine Van Geyn. She's previously the Ontario Director at the Canadian Taxpayers Foundation, and she's currently the Litigation Director at the Canadian Constitution Foundation. So, Christine, can you tell us a little bit more about what you think about this promised hate speech legislation?
Yeah, so it hasn't been proposed yet, but
yes,
there are sort of some different approaches that the government seems to be taking. First, we do already criminalize hate speech in Canada. And I think that's in section 318 and 319 of the criminal code. That law, as it exists now, doesn't get the balance right between protecting victims and restricting speech. Any limits on free expression need to be tailored really narrowly and used extremely conservatively, because we're talking about a fundamental right. And the current speech laws use terms that are inherently vague. They don't define hate. They rely on emotion, and they invite subjective interpretation. And these are laws that have the potential to put people in prison for up to 2 years. So when you're dealing with a criminal penalty like that, you need to be really restrictive in how it's applied. And the current laws already are not restrictive enough in ensuring that people have their liberties protected. Of course, I don't like hate speech. I don't like hateful speech. I don't like when people write or say terrible things. But I also don't believe in putting people in prison for vague, broad, or arbitrary offenses that are determined on a subjective standard. So we already have that law. What the government's proposing doing is a sort of multi-pronged approach through justice, the Ministry of the Justice Department, and the Heritage Department. The new approach has proposed a couple of things. First, they have suggested removing the requirement in the current criminal law that requires the provincial attorney generals to consent to a hate speech prosecution, or creating guidelines on when an attorney general must approve or not approve. They're talking about removing that. We have a problem with that. I mean, in my mind, the requirement of the attorney general to consent or not consent to the application of an unjust and unconstitutional law is a little bit irrelevant. But since the Supreme Court has upheld that this law is constitutional, at least the attorney general's consent is supposed to, and when this law was enacted, the consent was designed to act as a safeguard on expression, so that only cases that had a reasonable chance of success and were in the public interest in prosecuting would be pursued. So that's one of the proposed changes. Another proposed change is creating what's called a peace bond in the criminal code that imposes preconditions. So, for example, restricting internet use. A peace bond requires the defendant to, it's called keep the peace and abide by these conditions to ensure good conduct. This is, in our mind, a really astounding proposal to extend even further the reach of an unjust law. And future anticipated criminal conduct, in this case, is speech, where no actual harm to any specific person needs to be proven by the government. So it's a anticipatory restriction on liberty that has no victims, potentially. It doesn't require actual incitement. It doesn't require actual hatred in unspecified persons. And this creation of a peace bond we're deeply opposed to as well. The third proposal is the creation, the third sort of Justice Department proposal is the recreation of a civil remedy. So I don't know how many of you remember back in when Stephen Harper was the Prime Minister, there was a section of the Canada Human Rights Act that it was Section 13, and it was a civil remedy for hate speech. So if you were an individual person who felt that they had been subjected or their group had been subjected to hatred, you could bring a complaint to the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and they would decide whether or not to pursue that with the Human Rights Tribunal. For a whole lot of reasons, this was viewed as really had a lot of problems. It was applied sort of a lot of arguments were said that it was applied in a politically correct way. So some groups would be subject to prosecution and other groups would not be subject to prosecution for objectively discriminating against the same groups of people. It's just who was engaging in the discrimination was usually more in a category that would be more sympathetic to certain political groups. So it was repealed in 2013 by the Harper government. It had been highly politicized, so the government's now talking about bringing it back. We would be very opposed to this because it's essentially a form of private censorship. The person who has been accused has the burden of defending themselves, and the person who is accusing bears no burden. They simply make a complaint to the government, and the government brings a prosecution against another individual for things that are undefined or really are more like group defamation than something that rises to the level of criminal concern. So those are some of the three proposals the government has for justice. There's also a proposal through Heritage to require platforms to have a 24-hour takedown requirement if something rises to, I guess, the level of criminal hate speech, but it's unclear if that would now include the type of speech contemplated in this new human rights law. It's unclear, and in our view, in either of those conditions, those would be limits on our charter protected right to freedom of expression.
And so, what do we know about? I just wanted to kind of clarify. It seems like we have more detail about what the government is planning to do, criminal code wise, but that we still don't know anything about what the plans might be for the Heritage takedown notice, a piece of this that would affect platforms. Do I have that?
It seems like there has been more publication on the justice reforms because there was a parliamentary report that was released last year. And there was also a working paper that was sent to a whole bunch of people who are involved in these issues. So organizations like platforms and the CBC. Interestingly, the consultation paper was not sent to my organization, despite the fact that my organization has been a longstanding advocate for freedom of expression in Canada. And we have been involved as interveners in the leading cases on hate speech law in Canada, including the Whatcott decision. The government didn't feel we should receive this consultation paper, even though we were involved in the Supreme Court litigation on this issue. I think that type of consultation, it kind of throws into question if there is any interest in hearing from organizations that advocate for freedom of expression.
If I could just go back to the film and television thing before, I don't want to be the grumpy old guy and all negative on that sort of stuff, as Rachel said, but the purpose of public policy is for the industries you're talking about and the people within them to flourish, right? So about 25 years ago, the CRTC first looked at the online world and claimed the turf. Nobody ever challenged it because it also exempted itself from turf, put it under an exemption order. People in the industry from time to time came and asked for the exemption order to be lifted because they feared what the impact this would have on the industry and the system. It definitely had an impact on the system. But in terms of the industry, the CRTC very wisely in those days just said, let it be. Let's just see what happens, right? Let's let this industry unfold, let it flourish. And it did. The last 10 years have been the greatest 10 years for the Canadian film and television industries in its history. It has grown by 80% from a $5 billion industry to a $9 billion industry. And a great deal of that has been driven by the likes of Netflix and others investing in Canada. Outside the system, I mean, for people inside the system, that's all pretty scary when you have this nice closed system where the only fights that really occur is how big is my slice of pie, of the financial pie, going to be. It's never really consumer focused. It's all about people inside the industry and how much they get. So, even official CanCon in the last industry CMPA stats had its best 2 years, certified CanCon in terms of that. And that's a whole other kettle of fish. But at the end of the day, sort of going back, there's a theme in all these areas is, what is the problem, right? Why are you messing or monkeying with this business? It's the same with the newspaper things. I mean, there's an ad I saw online from the Ottawa Citizen this morning by Unifor talking about how much money Google makes. And it's not sharing any of this with the newspaper industry because every time, somebody searches on there, they're going to find a news story, and the newspaper industry isn't getting any money. Well, I mean, why not just newspapers? Why not airlines and hotels, right? I mean, why not Kijiji? Shouldn't they get a take from Google too? I mean, maybe those are all other issues, but again, there's intervention happening in which, you have to ask who benefits, right? Does the consumer benefit? Will the consumer be happier? Will they have more freedom? Will they have more product with Guilbeault's legislation? Will the industry be better? Will there be more jobs? Will there be more investment? Will there be more film and television produced in Canada, right? Why would you take those risks? You're on a roll. Everything's working really, really well in terms of that, right? Except it's outside the system, right? So the system moves to capture it and bring it in. It'll continue to provide, reasonable standards of living for the people inside the system and that sort of stuff, but there will be no innovation and that sort of stuff. The internet is such a fabulous opportunity. And to see it sort of grabbed up with this 1985 mindset. I mean, this is supposed to be a progressive, forward-thinking government, which even when Melanie Joly was in there, talked about, she didn't even have cable. She watched streaming services and that. And in 3 years, it's become the most regressive government in the last 50 years in terms of public policy in these areas, right? I mean, it's breathtaking in the extent that it goes. There is no evidence for that there are problems in these areas. I mean, you can make things up and you can make accusations, but the newspaper argument doesn't have a heck of a lot of foundation. And the solution seems to be newspapers need money. Google has some. Facebook has some. Let's go get it. That's it. In the case of Netflix, they're probably already investing the amount of money that the government would mandate that they do, right? If they're talking 25, 30% of revenue, which Bell Media does, they're probably already spending that. So if you make them spend it in places where they can't direct and choose, and they pay, they'll just stop the other stuff, right? So, I mean, there's no net gain in terms of that. It's hopefully people will pause and ask the question, whose life does this make better? And whose lives does it not make better? And will the industry flourish as it has? Will there be more jobs or less? End of rant.
That's a good rant.
And Rachel,
tell me,
sorry, I just wanted to throw it to Rachel to see if she had any responses to what we've heard in the last little while.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with Peter's assessment of the Broadcasting Act reforms. I mean, it doesn't really affect platforms like Facebook so much because we're not doing that offering online streaming services by and large. But Peter's right. Netflix, Disney Plus, others have been tremendously beneficial for the Canadian production sector already. It's sort of unclear what putting a regulatory framework around them will do. I mean, clearly the intent is to get them to contribute to Canadian content. That's already happening. So maybe this is just sort of formalizing, again, what they're already doing. I think what's good news is that they won't be required to be licensed by the CRTC. I think that's a positive piece of the legislation. So, I mean, from Facebook's perspective, we're sort of watching this with interest. I think what Minister Guilbeault said at his press conference was that this bill was the first step in a broader effort by the government to engage in regulation of the internet and online regulation, which is, of course, why we're talking about this on the panel today. The pieces we will be more interested in, obviously, are support for news publishers, whether the government is going to try and introduce a model like Australia's, which essentially requires Facebook and Google and just those two companies to engage in kind of negotiate. I'm going to call it negotiation in quotes, negotiation at gunpoint with mainstream news publishers to give them a chunk of money. It doesn't really, in our view, doesn't account for the value that publishers already receive when platforms transfer eyeballs back to news publisher sites. I mean, think about how this model works, right? Facebook does not take a news content and post it proactively on the platform. News publishers themselves actually post their content on platforms like Facebook, and then users post news content on Facebook as well. Although that's relatively uncommon. That's not a large percentage of the material that you'll see in your news feed on Facebook, for instance. So it's publishers themselves that are really pushing the material, their content to the platform, and it's because that's where people are. That's where the eyeballs are. And when they post that content on Facebook, people click on it and they go back to the publisher's news sites, so back to their websites. And the publishers can then monetize that by selling advertising on their websites that people are being driven to by these clicks on Facebook and other platforms. So we think there's a lot of value in that for publishers that just is not accounted for in the Australian model. But what the argument essentially is, as Peter says, is that, advertising revenue has migrated to platforms where people are, where Canadians are, and that has negatively impacted traditional news publishers who used to have essentially a monopoly on that kind of advertising, and they want a piece of it. And there's, it's really as simple as that. So there isn't a good, as I say, there's not, I think, a good kind of business argument for having Facebook or Google simply give money to news publishers. I don't think that really makes sense from a policy perspective. I think, though, and we keep trying to emphasize this, like we want to make sure that news journalism, independent news journalism, which we view as essential to democracy, essential to keeping governments accountable, essential to transparency, is supported, and that it doesn't simply just disappear, especially in our local communities. And that's where journalism really is most at threat. There are hardly any journalists now covering what's going on at the municipal level, for instance, what's going on in our city halls. So we think it's essential to support that kind of journalism. And we're doing that through things like, partnerships with Canadian Press to create, 8 new local journalism jobs, for instance. But it's clear that we need to figure out what more sustainable business models are for news publishers to make sure that we don't lose that kind of independent oversight of governments in Canada. So that is an ongoing discussion, and we're very hopeful that we can work with news publishers to support the transition to those kinds of business models.
So if we can just touch on that briefly. Yes, journalism is important to democracy. It is overstated that it's the foundation of democracy. Democracy pre-existed what we know as journalism by about 2,000 years when the Greeks got it going. But what was the foundation was freedom of speech, right? And the internet is speech, essentially. It is a platform for freedom of speech where people can communicate back and forth, up and down. Unlike cable, it's not the new cable. It's an interactive platform. And Facebook did dodge the legislation because they exempted user-generated content in terms of that. Newspapers used to spend an awful lot of money delivering their product. It was a very expensive operation, and the price of a newspaper was relatively cheap over the years. These social media and other platforms and the internet gave them the opportunity to deliver their product to people for free. And they saved tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars as an industry in doing that. So, I mean, I understand and I'm sympathetic. I don't want to beat up on journalists in that sort of sense, but what they need in this is a very disruptive time. Right? This is the invention of the automobile. This is the invention of the printing press. Old business models don't work anymore. And what government and public policy should be doing is finding ways to make this transition. I mean, they talk about it in terms of the energy industry all the time, right? It's a dying industry. We need to help transition to renewables and that sort of stuff. But when it comes to communications and the internet and speech and journalism, they just don't get it at all. Creating supports for an industry such as the newspaper industry right now is only going to prop it up for a while. You're just putting extra supports underneath a bad foundation, right? What you need to do is be helping it build a new foundation, helping it transition into something better and something that will be sustainable, which is words that should make sense to this government in the long term in terms of that. And the other part is by propping up the old models with these make-believe. I mean, these are fictions that are coming out about where these numbers come from. You stifle innovation. You stifle the people who are out there experimenting and trying to do startups and that sort of stuff. So if you're going to subsidize anything, and direct subsidies generally a very, very bad idea, but you can subsidize it by tax frameworks and policy frameworks and that sort of stuff. It should be the next world, not the old world, right? I mean, if we're going to be looking forward and making things better, you don't give newspapers that are a shell of their former selves money to just still be stuck where they're stuck.
While at the same time contemplating bringing back civil penalties for offensive speech. I mean, the Canadian Human Rights Act, the Section 13 civil penalty that I had talked about, one of the reasons it was repealed was because of multiple claims brought against opinion columnist Mark Steyn. And you can have whatever opinion you want about Mark Steyn, but he wrote a column in Maclean's, which is not an obscure publication. And he was subject to multiple, in three different jurisdictions in Canada, human rights complaints because of what he had written. He'd written a column about changing demographics in Canada, which used blunt and not politically correct language. And you can disagree with the content of his opinion or with the way that he delivered it. But what he had written was not criminal. It was not hate. It did not cause violence. It was not a threat. But he had to defend himself in front of multiple human rights tribunals. He did so successfully. And now the government wants to bring back this type of liability on individual, I guess not journalists, but to these publications. It's a problem that shows the lack of understanding of the value of free expression that this government has.
Yeah, I mean, so we should talk about that because the approach by platforms is a little bit different. And just to address Peter's point, I should say he's absolutely right. There are outlets, really exciting new digital startups that have been successful in this transition. Some really good right-leaning news outlets as well that I would encourage everyone to read and to look at. The Post Millennial has done really well. New outlet called The Line, started up by a journalist called Jen Gerson, is just excellent. The fact that we have these new kind of digital news outlets that I think reflect center-right perspectives is tremendously exciting. We still need to deal with the mainstream publishers and what's going to happen to them, but it's true the internet's opened up a world of opportunity for smaller independent journalism outlets. Just on the hate speech front, I mean, look, Christine's right that we don't want to limit, we want to be very careful about limiting what people can say as a general rule. And I would have called myself kind of a free speech absolutist for many years. My perspective on that has changed working for social media platforms simply because if you throw the doors wide open to letting people say whatever they want to say on a social media platform, unfortunately, the reality is it gets totally overtaken by some pretty toxic stuff. And it may not be, maybe it shouldn't be illegal. It certainly shouldn't be criminalized. But social media platforms, I think, have a right and perhaps even an obligation to clean some of that up off their platforms, because without it, it's just, without doing that, the platforms just become an unpleasant place to be. And, you know, I love platforms like Twitter. I use them all the time, but they can get pretty unpleasant and pretty toxic. And I see why, you know, people who are just looking for news or looking for, you know, a good, clean political debate get driven away from social media because it can be just such an unpleasant place.
So that's why the platforms have their own community standards, right?
Exactly. And that's my point. You know, that the platforms, and there are complaints that the platforms are too strict about, you know, what they allow and don't allow, you know, people to say, and that there's too much censorship, and that, you know, they pull down things that they shouldn't pull down. And yes, in some cases that's true. But to be honest, the line, I think, needs to be different for social media platforms because they need to think about the experience for the broadest number of users. Secondarily, they also need to think about the experience for advertisers who are the source of revenue supporting these services, right? And if advertisers don't want to be, don't want to have their ads or their businesses appearing adjacent to toxic material, that social media platforms have to take that into account as well. So I think and Christine, I agree with you on what you're saying about being very careful about criminalizing or making speech illegal. I do think that's a slightly different discussion from what platforms should and shouldn't allow people to say on those services.
It's a totally different discussion. I mean, Facebook is a private organization. Twitter's a private organization. They can have their own standards about what type of conduct they allow on their platforms. It's a different matter when you are subjecting someone to a term of imprisonment, a large fine, or civil penalties. These are consequences that can only be imposed by governments. Facebook can't put you in, they can put you in Facebook jail, but they can't put you in actual jail. And that's what my concern is the intersection of speech that is controversial and the government's power to come down on you with the full force of the state.
100%.
With rare exception, we do not speak with permission of the state, right? I mean, there is a hate law right now, which is, you know, the bar is very high, and it should be.
That's not high enough.
Well,
it doesn't require. It doesn't require.
But if you are going to have one, it has to be, you know, you can't, you know, shout fire in a crowded theater, for instance, things like that, where you behave irresponsibly and you can cause harm, you can cause direct physical harm to people. But we live in an age when silence is violence, and speech is considered to be acts of violence and that sort of stuff. So there's a whole new cultural development going on there. And so the discussion is that much more important in terms of the value of speech. I mean, you're dead right with Facebook or Twitter, whatever. They're their own private business. They, it's your own club. You sign up and you have to wear a tie, or you can't wear jeans, or whatever the rules are, right? And Facebook had that right from the start, because it wanted to be a pleasant place where you found your old college roommate and your high school friends and that sort of stuff. And that's really what it is. And if you go on there and there's things you find offensive on there, you're not going to go there, right? So with the speech area, that's, like I said, these are intertwined. The internet is speech at its heart, in terms of that, and that's why it's so important that it be left alone. In terms of that.
Yeah, I'd just like to one of the things that we haven't quite touched on, which is the proposal of the 24-hour takedown requirement, which sort of empowers the government would impose a penalty onto a platform if they fail to remove content that is either rises to the civil standard or to the criminal standard. We don't know yet. And the problem with this is Facebook would then be acting sort of under the authority of the government in being required to remove this type of content. And one of the concerns that we have with that is the creation of a chilling effect. So platforms might seek to avoid a penalty being imposed upon them. So they would preemptively take down content that doesn't actually meet the threshold. And in that case, you could have platforms that are removing content that is an important part of political and public debate. And raises important questions, but doesn't actually rise to any standard that the government could require a takedown. And the fact that the standard is inherently subjective means that the takedown could be done in a way that is overly speech impairing. So I think that is a big concern about what we're going to see coming from this government. And other jurisdictions do have takedown requirements like this as well. There's also another issue I hadn't touched on, which is related to the whole concept of fake news. The fake news in Canada, we have a law that was passed about a year ago related to election speech. And if you publish a statement on Facebook that is misstates certain biographical information about a candidate or a person associated with a candidate. Rachel, are you a person associated with a candidate? I see you on CBC a lot talking about the Conservative Party. Would you rise to that standard? The law doesn't actually specify. So if I said something incorrect about your education or about who you're associated with professionally, and I didn't even know that statement was false, the current law in Canada is that I could be subject to a $50,000 fine and 5 years imprisonment for not even knowing that I'd made a mistake about a person who's not even a candidate for election. This is a huge, huge problem. And you could have, people sharing all kinds of stuff on Facebook who could be captured by this law. So that's a law we're actually challenging right now, and we're expecting a result in later this month, hopefully, actually.
When I was at the CRTC sometime, there was a phrase we used on occasion, and I think, I don't know, maybe we've seen some of that already. If you speak about regulating something enough, other people will do it for you, particularly when it's tricky. If you talk about social media behavior and that, maybe the social media companies will take care of it for you because it's a little tricky legally, with this charter stuff and that sort of stuff. But the private companies can do what the state can't. We called it regulation by raised eyebrow. you just kind of look at something long enough and say, it'd be nice if this problem went away. And sometimes it does through that sort of stuff. But the companies involved then have to manage that response. Like Rachel said, they get pushback from people regarding some of their comments if they get removed from Facebook and that sort of stuff. But, there's enough room on the internet. It's infinite. That there should be places where people can go where they can have civilized political debates. There's a reason why most of the sane world does not go on Twitter. In terms of that, it's a place where people go to influence media because media think it's the real world, and we all share that fantasy and go along with it together, right? In terms of that sort of stuff, because it's too mean too often, right? But that's a sort of market force that takes care of itself. Ditto with Facebook. People don't want to fight with their friends too much. And thank heavens the US election is over, so my American friends can be friends again and I can like them.
And I did want to jump in because there's something I wanted to get everybody's perspective on before we throw it to audience questions, which I really also want to get to. So maybe just really briefly, I wanted to get everybody's opinion on what the policy towards some of these issues we've been talking about should be. Because I've been, following this for a while. There seems to have been a shift in the Conservative Party's view on some of this. On some of these issues, they were calling for corporate tax for the biggest web giants in the last election. The reaction of the heritage critic to Minister Guilbeault's legislation this week was that it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't oblige Facebook and Google to pay their fair share, for example. He posted that on Twitter. So there seems to have been a kind of general shift towards some kind of agreement that some type of regulation is needed. So I wanted to hear from each of you, what should any government's policies be on these issues that we've been talking about?
So just bring me up to speed on what the opposition critic said, because I've been trying to find it. That's the Conservative critic?
Elaine Reyes. So I have on Broadcasting Act, this is on Twitter, I just pulled it up. No obligation for Facebook and Google to pay their fair share, no fiscal equity with Netflix, no revenue sharing with media, no clear guideline for French content, balls returned to the CRTC seriously.
Yeah, well then it's really just become a Montreal issue, because that's kind of where it emerged from. That's where the forces for change were the most persuasive. And if the Conservatives are doing that, then they're still having 2008 flashbacks or something like that. And they're afraid to say anything that they think would cause offense to the Montreal cultural community in terms of those sorts of things. There are real issues regarding taxation for the foreign-based companies. Most of that is being dealt with through an OECD process. You can't have, in the case of Netflix, for instance, if there's $800 million or $1 billion in Canadian revenue leaving the country, which for some reason nobody's charging, they would happily collect and remit GST on that. But the successive governments seem afraid of that. Saskatchewan and Quebec both collect PST on that, those sorts of things. Finding solutions to taxation to make sure that revenue just isn't leaving your country. That wouldn't be acceptable, and no tax coming back. That makes sense. In terms of the cultural side of the thing, though, despite all this going on, there is no evidence at all that the Conservative Party has any interest whatsoever in standing up for internet freedom and consumer choice and that sort of stuff. It's the space is clear for the Liberals to run the table on this intervention and raise the cost to consumers and that sort of stuff to satisfy what is a very, very small percentage of the Canadian film and television industry that has a vested interest. I get where the concern is coming from that sector. 1/3 of all cultural funds have always gone to Francophone product and 2/3 to Anglophone. That made a lot of sense when 30% of the population of the country was Francophone, people who spoke, defined as people who speak French in the home. It's now less than 22% because of demographic shifts. And I think that that needs to be funded. I don't mind there being an uptick on that, but this is one of the problems that people are facing. They want to hang on to their 1/3, and who wouldn't, if you had that deal? But that's where part of the pressure comes from. It's a really sticky wicket politically. I don't know how anybody gets out of that other than to answer your question after that long-winded preamble. Push for, as I said, the transition. How are we going to get from 1980 to 2040 and have all these industries successful and flourishing in both languages? Culture triggers everything in Quebec. It's to the barricades at any moment, and I respect that. So let's build something. Let's build something new and vibrant and exciting. That's where public policy needs to be focused. And then the taxation issue and GST, those should be no-brainers.
Yeah, I agree. I agree 100% with that. I think there's no question that the online platform should be paying more tax. Again, there's certainly no objection to that on the part of, speaking for Facebook, on the part of Facebook. As Peter mentions, we already pay provincial sales tax in Quebec and Saskatchewan because those governments have introduced legislation to allow for that. I expect that will come at some point soon on the federal front. I don't really understand the CPC position on the cultural issues. As Peter says, I suspect, unfortunately, that they're taking those positions with an eye to electoral fortunes in Quebec. And thinking that, the sort of beating the drum of additional money into Canadian content from companies like Netflix is just good politics. So I think there's probably no more to it than that. But yeah, I can't say it better than Peter has. On all of these fronts, what we should be working towards is a strong and flourishing news journalism industry, strong and flourishing Canadian production industry. And that platforms doing business in Canada are paying the sort of fair and appropriate share of taxes to help support all of those things. Again, I think the most kind of controversial piece of this is what do governments do about, online hate speech, or how do they even define hate speech? And I think the real concern, certainly for Conservatives, is that, governments, if they're asked to define it, may define it to include speech that's critical of the government. I'd like to say that no government would ever, in Canada at least, would ever do that. They'd be very careful about restricting limitations on speech like that. But I'm not totally confident that's the case. And that's my personal view. That's not a Facebook view. I do think honestly, I do think it's more appropriate for people who are elected by Canadians to make these kinds of decisions rather than for private companies to make them. But I also understand why people are nervous about this government drawing those lines because, they haven't always in the past, if I'm being diplomatic, demonstrated a respect for the principles of free speech and certainly for the right to be critical, sometimes extremely critical, of government policy and government actions. So that, I think, is going to be the real debate for the next few months as the government figures out how to do that.
And Christine, I don't want to cut you off, but we did promise to get to audience questions. So okay. I'm hoping I can throw that over to Kate, and then maybe you can have first crack at the audience question and also give us, I want to hear your opinion on this as well, obviously. So Kate, I'm throwing it to you.
Great. Okay. Thanks, everybody. And yeah, we've had a few audience questions come in. Just before I get to those, go ahead, Christine. You said to be quick with your thought on what the policy should be. So I thought we'd wrap there and then we can go over to audience cues.
So our view is that the three proposed changes to in that working paper, the the ones that I discussed at the beginning, including the civil remedy under the human rights legislation, those should not move forward. We think that there should be amendments to the existing criminal law to make it clear that hate speech laws must be narrowly applied to deal only with content that advocates for real violence on an objective standard rather than criminalizing emotions. That's my main point.
Got you. Okay. So we had a few questions come in, and this may be surprising or not, but Rachel, a lot of them are directed towards kind of you and kind of broader platform issues. Christine mentioned the election speech law that was brought in last year, just before the 2019 election. And one of the questions generally relates to the process of checking the fact checkers, for lack of a better term. So how do platforms go about making sure that those who are responsible for taking down controversial fake news, something that is deemed to have violated community standards, how does that process work? Can you shine a little bit of light on that process? And then also the appeals process. This particular question is motivated by a group that had put something out on Facebook. It was taken down. It was subsequently later ruled to actually not have violated community standards, but they were subject to being taken offline for about a 48-hour period. So just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that process, if possible.
Yeah, that is the process. So we work with about 70 different independent fact checkers in 80 different languages globally. It is a global effort. They have to be certified. These fact checkers all have to be certified by like an independent fact checking institute. And they sort of cross the political spectrum too. So I know there's a sense that the fact checkers all approach the job from a particular perspective. That's not true. We have partners like Breitbart in the U.S. Who are perceived or who are on the right side of the spectrum. Also have partners like USA Today in the U.S. In Canada, Radio Canada is one of the fact checkers. So they really sort of across the spectrum in terms of perspective, but the way they approach fact checking, of course, is supposed to be entirely objective. They don't always get it right, and so there is an appeal process by which you can say, I don't agree with the fact checker's decision. Can it please be reviewed? It will then be reviewed by a different checker. Who can overturn the decision on appeal, and then whatever strikes were set against the account or the page are removed. So that is essentially the process. I understand not everyone is completely happy with how it works. Sometimes it takes too long to get an appeal decision and to have material that was inappropriately removed or flagged back up again. But overall, I think it provides some guardrails around material, around misinformation in particular. There was a lot of sensitivity to that in the context of the U.S. election, because truthfully, we just saw a lot of people and some outlets posting information about the election, about how to vote, about who was eligible to vote. For instance, that was just wrong and misleading. And so the fact checkers are in place to catch stuff like that and to flag it or remove it. I think one thing that will help with this is we've just set up a board, an entity called the Oversight Board, which I think is sort of a really neat initiative. It's people have called it kind of a Supreme Court for Facebook, right? It's a judicial branch within a private sector company, which is unprecedented. But what the Oversight Board is going to do is completely independent of Facebook. It will hear user appeals from decisions on content that Facebook makes. So if Facebook decides to remove content or flag it or deal with it in a way that a user is unhappy with, they can then appeal that decision to the Oversight Board. And the board is going to look at those cases individually and in bundles, and will issue decisions, but also issue guidance to Facebook about how it should handle similar cases in future. So it's going to be, I know there's concern sometimes about the fact checkers. I think the oversight board is going to be helpful on that front, because it will be just a completely independent body that's making some of these determinations, and telling Facebook if it thinks the company is being, overzealous in some instances and removing content.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, and that's again a process that I assume would be impacted should 24-hour takedown notice be required. I think the concern that a lot of conservatives have around that particular part of speech policy is that platforms will be incentivized to remove content that is questionable much faster because the government has said that they must do so or face financial penalty. And then that may lead to a bit of a slippery slope of platforms just quickly taking things down as opposed to applying some of those oversight mechanisms that you mentioned. Related to that, we also have a question here around fee structures. Would platforms, I understand you couldn't probably answer this on Facebook's behalf necessarily, but is there a scenario where a user of a social platform may be in a position to pay a fee so that they could have some type of control over the content that they see or the algorithm in some way? So, I think that this question is probably getting at trying to create a bit of a home or a safe space for the content they want as opposed to being bombarded with maybe things that they don't want to see. Is that something that platforms may look to if the regulatory environment gets too onerous?
Yeah, I don't think Facebook is certainly not contemplating like a fee for service model. I mean, the whole sort of purpose of setting up the platform right from its inception was so it would be an entirely free service to users and a place for people to organize and communicate, talk to their friends and family, and that there would be no financial barrier to that. So I don't think there's any intent to kind of change that model. I will say, though, that it's quite easy. I know this isn't true for every platform. It's quite easy on Facebook to curate your own experience. So nothing will appear in your news feed unless you have expressed an interest in it. So if you have friended someone, or if you've liked a page, or if you've interacted with a particular business on Facebook, like that's the stuff that appears in your news feed, and your news feed is unique to you. So because my network is a conservative one, I tend to like the pages of conservative parties provincially and federally. My newsfeed is just like entirely sort of the conservative world. It's probably too much of a bubble, frankly, because I don't get much unless I might have a couple of liberal friends whose opinions sometimes pop up in my newsfeed, but I don't see much of other perspectives. In fact, I have to go seek them out. I think we should be cautious. And this is just my view. I think we should be cautious about creating those bubbles for ourselves. I think we should seek out different views and different opinions across the political spectrum so we can constantly be calibrating where we stand and what our opinions are on particular issues. I think it's valuable. I think we don't want to get polarized. I would not like to see Canada go down the same path that the U.S. has, where we have this very tribal approach to politics, and where you don't have friends who aren't of your political persuasion, or you don't even want sort of relatives in your network who don't agree with you politically. I think that would be unfortunate. So while you can, I think, curate that kind of bubble for yourself on a platform like Facebook, I don't necessarily think that's what we should try and do kind of across the board.
All right, two more questions that I'll throw to the group, and if you can answer both in your response, that would be helpful. As I know we're up against the clock here, and we'll start with Peter, and then Christine, and then finish with Rachel. One is to just provide your view. I've had a number of questions come in on Twitter's decision to block the New York Post for content that they were running related to Hunter Biden during the election campaign, and how that may have been precedent setting in some way. So if you could provide a few comments on that. And then lastly, the idea of having the web giants pay for domestic content, somebody's wondering if maybe a better public policy option might not be to level the playing field for domestic content producers. So rather than having the American companies pay for that content, eliminating some of the fees or reducing the burden on Canadian content providers and creators so that it is a more level playing field. So Peter, can I get your two thoughts on that? And then we'll have Christine and Rachel, and then I think we're up against time.
Sure. On the Twitter issue, I think people need to distinguish between the actions of a private company and a general public policy. I mean, Twitter can do whatever it wants with Twitter. In terms of that, it will have to deal with the market forces it unleashes by its decisions. So if it makes a decision that's unpopular, people will like it less and it will be less profitable. If it makes decisions that are popular, people will like it more. But in terms of public policy, I don't see that as an area in which government should be involved or intervening. In terms of the web giants, get money from web giants. So as quick as I can, what's happening is by getting money from web giants is that the burden of funding Canada's cultural institutions is shifting offshore. It's leaving the country, that's why they're not licensing them, because if they in order to license them, they'd have to be Canadian owned and controlled legally. So they've made it more of a registration. They've created a different category for it. And that creates the opportunity for them to leave. And it could create the opportunity for Netflix to say, we'll just sell our content to Bell and they'll put it on Crave. So you could monopolize, Canada could monopolize that industry through there as well. But in terms of leveling the burden, there is an exchange that the licensed companies get. They get protected. And now that's what they're looking for from the streaming. But yes, I mean, that's the discussion we should be having is moving forward. How do we deal with the new world that the internet has unleashed in a way that allows everybody to flourish? Yes, rather than just stopping progress is not the answer. That's it.
My is that Twitter can do what Twitter wants to do. It's its own company, and we always need to distinguish that our right to freedom of expression is something that is owed to us by the government, not by private companies. So when we talk about our constitutional freedoms, they're in relation to the state, not in relation to companies like Twitter. If you don't like how Twitter is running their platform, just take your ball and go home. That's all I can say for you. With respect to the other question, I just simply don't have the expertise to comment.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, the New York Post article certainly caused a lot of upheaval around the decisions that the platforms had made on that. I would say on Facebook's side, they didn't block sharing. The platform did not block sharing of the article. It did not block comment on the article. What it did was sort of downrank it, so it didn't go viral as quickly. So it was throttled, essentially. And they took a little bit of a different approach than Twitter did. I would say that wasn't unprecedented. That particular instance got a lot of attention, but that sort of approach to material, downranking it or throttling it pending fact check, is something that the platform has done before, and in fact indicated it would be doing with respect to U.S. election-related material in particular. So the FBI had said prior to the election period that there was a serious risk of what they called like a hack and leak operation or a hack and dump operation. And so we were on the lookout for any material that looked like that. This initially sort of raised some of those flags that it might be a hack and dump. And so it was throttled on that basis until the accuracy of it could be confirmed. But that's not a new approach. That's not an unprecedented approach. It's been taken in other instances too. This one just happened to get a lot of attention because we were very close to the election date. And the material was particularly interesting and, potentially inflammatory. So that was the approach to the New York Post article. I mean, look, on Canadian content, I defer to Peter on this. I think, to the extent we can remove barriers for domestic production and incentivize domestic production, I think that's a good thing. I think we want a strong and flourishing domestic industry, whether it's film production or news production. And we want to figure out how to take the policy steps to do that, that don't limit options, that don't limit competition and don't limit options for consumers. I think that's the approach we should be taking to kind of ensure the success of our own domestic industry.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that. So I think that brings us to the conclusion of the panel. And I know we ran a little bit over time, but there was a lot of audience interest in this discussion. And I want to thank our panelists and our moderator once again for your comments. I believe we're now going to have a quick pair of videos followed by our next panel on COVID response. So we'll be back with the next panel in a few minutes, but for now we'll be looking to some videos. Thank you again, Anya, Rachel, Christine, and Peter for your contributions today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Anja.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, guys.